How's it going, y'all? Titan Smash MTG, and today we're going to be looking at the top decks in Standard, post-rotation style. We're going to take a look at these top archetypes of the meta, see what they are losing, see what cards are not going to be there post-rotation anymore, and just see if they overall look like they'll be viable or not. Now, a few things to remember before we start this. One, we haven't seen Zendikar Rising spoilers yet, so obviously all these archetypes could get a shot in the arm from that, and you never know what they're going to add, whether it be for the mana basis to improve, whether it be for creatures, planeswalkers, all that kind of thing. However, I do think that we can look at what they're losing. In some of these decks, if you're losing over half your cards, yes, you can still maybe be viable, but it's not going to be the same. So I think it's early enough that we can still take a look at these decks. Now, these may not be your top 10 decks of the archetype, but I wanted to look at 10 that are pretty dominant right now, or things that we see in the meta, and just take a look and see if they have a chance of existing post-rotation or not. So without further ado, let's take a look at these decks. Let's get into some speculation. Ooh, let's go. So first deck we'll talk about here, the number one deck in Standard for a good bit now, is Sultai Ramp, Sultai Control. So when we're looking at Sultai Ramp, it's just a big bundle of value here. You're trying to ramp early or have disruption early, whether it be through thought erasures, your eliminates, it's the early removal. Some of these play Heartless Act in the main, but basically you're trying to have that 2-mana spell be for either disruption, removal, or things like Aether Gust, which people are still main decking right now. That turn 3, that's when you get your Narset, your Euro down, and basically, regardless of how these build out, what you're trying to do is you get that Nissa down on turn 4, if you can, and then turn 5, you're holding up Shark Typhoons, you're holding up Casualty of War and playing it, or some of these play Ugin and go a little bit bigger over the top. But this is Sultai Ramp, the number one deck in the meta. Let's see what it loses. So looking at this now, it loses quite a bit. So we still have the Aether Gust in there, but we don't know if Aether Gust will be main deckable anymore. I hope we get to a point where things like Mystical Dispute and Aether Gust just aren't main deckable anymore, because sideboard cards should not be played in main decks. It'll be losing Hydroid Krasis, which is a huge loss. Hydroid Krasis is one of the biggest value creatures in Standard since it's been printed. Things like Thought Erasure, yes, they lose that, but Agonizing Remorse is an easy swap there. Losing Narset, now not every list even played Narsets, but any kind of 3-mana Planeswalker that generates that kind of value is a big loss. They have the 4 of Euro coming back, so no worries there. Extinction Event, still here to stay. But this is where it starts to get interesting. Tamiyo, what most of these decks play at least a 1 of, no more Tamiyo. Nissa, who shakes the world, the biggest card in the whole deck probably, gone. Bye, get the hell out of here, Nissa, it's gone. And then for these playing Casualty Wars at the top end, also it's leaving. Yes, they have the Shark Typhoon there, and they have the Ugins they can put in there. So Sultai is kind of a weird spot because they do lose a big chunk of their deck, but I think they have enough tools that are disposable because Blue-Green has still got such a shot in the arm and so many different tools to use. They can play 4-mana Teferi instead. But I'm curious to see how they adjust to this because they do lose quite a bit of things, but I think Sultai will still be around. Probably the biggest thing they lose here are the Breeding Pools, the Overgrown Tombs, and the Watery Graves. We'll have to see what the Mana Gods decide to give us in Zendikar Rising, but losing your Shocklands is a big deal in 3-color decks, and they have to run a 4 of each one of those. And if you're in a place where you're just playing Triomes, Fable Passages, and Basics, you better hope for some kind of fast land, check land kind of thing, or else I don't know if these 3-mana decks can actually make it work, because if you're just playing tap lands and a bunch of basic all the time, you're going to lose games just strictly due to your mana there. So while I do expect Sultai still have enough powerful answers, you still have Euro, you still have Shark Typhoon, you have Extinction Event, you definitely have a good basis of things there. But losing things like Nissa, Krasis, Casualty of War, that's your big payoff cards there in this deck. And losing all of those, it's going to be rough. So I think Sultai Ramp will find a way to exist because it seems like it has for a while now. But if we don't get good lands and good mana here, I pity the fool that tries to play this because it's just not going to work. Let's take a look at another deck. Let's go! So next up is Mono Green Aggro / Mono Green Stompy. Now obviously these decks can have a little bit of variation, be built in different ways, but overall they have the same kind of core group of cards. The one card I see on here that I don't usually see is Nissa, but again she's leaving anyway, so maybe that's okay for green. So here's what they're missing. You'll notice here at the 1-drop slot they do lose all their Pel Collectors, which is pretty big because Mono Green, you have the Heart's Desire from Lovestruck Beast, you have Stonecoil Serpent, which can technically be a 1-drop. But overall, they just don't have that pure 1-drop they can usually put in there. Now, I think Wildwood Tracker will probably be the card to replace this, but it's not on the same kind of level as Pel Collector, I don't think. At the 2-drop slot, they also lose Barkhide Troll, which I think has been a really underrated, it's always a 4 of that you're really never excited to see. But a 2-mana 3/3 that can give itself hexproof is pretty nice. So I think losing Barkhide Troll, though not anything like super exciting, it does make more of a difference than people think. Scavenging Ooze here to stay. Lovestruck Beast here to stay. Questing Beast here to stay. The Vivians. Now, the Vivian's gone. That's another big one because Vivian Arcbow Ranger has been a huge tool in these kind of decks. So, yes, there's the other Vivians we can play here. There's Garrick we can play here. There's definitely options mono green to adjust. But losing Vivian Arcbow Ranger, that was the best shell for this card by far. And anytime you've seen this come down to mono green, it's usually been really good. So, as a whole, mono green really doesn't lose a lot. They even get to keep their Castle Garenbrig, the Bonder's Enclave, Mobilized District Leads, but I mean, whatever. But overall, man, mono green really doesn't lose a lot. And this is even taking into account, you still have Yorvo, which is in here. Easily throw that thing in there, because a lot of decks play that. You have the things like Ranger's Guile, people like Cedric Phillips be putting that in his list. I think mono green's going to be a force to the new standard, because early on, you just want to have like big, stompy, aggressive decks early on when you don't know what to expect. And mono green still does that extremely well. So look out for mono green, the new standard. But with how little it actually loses, I think it'll be a huge player in new standard. So mono green still gets a big 2 thumbs up. Let's take a look at the next deck. Let's go. Alright, so next on the list is one of everybody's either favorites or least favorite, because everybody seems to have a love or hate relationship with Mono Red Aggro. Mono Red Aggro also in a really good place post-ban standard, I think. Now this list looks pretty different than what I'm kind of used to seeing, but as a whole, still a lot of the same things going on. And it's been really funny to me, because I've seen so many people say that people always say that Mono Red's gonna die whenever rotation happens. The hell you talking about? Forever Champion, here to stay. Ginger Brute doesn't really count, but it's here to stay if you play it. Now they lose Scorch Bitter. Obviously Scorch Bitter is a decent one drop. It's always one that, like, it's never been super exciting, but it's an obvious 4 of, and you still want to play it. I hate Rimrock Knight, but it's here to stay if you want to play it. Robber the Rich stays. Anax stays. Bolthound stays. Bonecrusher Giant stays. Embercleave stays. Torpin stays. Why are people saying this deck dies? Like, it loses almost nothing. Now, you do lose the Runaway Steamkins. That's not pictured here. That's a big one to lose. But a lot of times, even like on the draw, you know, it felt really terrible and isn't a good card either. So, while yes, it does lose some tools. It loses things like Tibalt and the sideboard and Chandra that people have been playing. As a whole, Mono Red has some really nice looking tools here. There's still other avenues to explore. And as always, cheap, aggressive creatures do get printed at a pretty common rate here. So, anybody that's sleeping on Mono Red post-rotation, maybe this is your first rotation, I don't know. But this deck's not going anywhere. It's going to be pretty damn strong. Any deck that gets to have the Anax and Embercleave still get to be there is really, really good. So, Mono Red's not going anywhere. If anything, it'll be one of the better choices when rotation comes. Again, we'll have to see what Zendikar Rising brings us. But as a whole, Mono Red has a lot of tools. So for any of you Mono Red truthfuls out there, yeah, I think you're in good hands. You're here to stay. Mono Red ain't going anywhere. Once again, that's 2 big thumbs up. Let's go to the next deck. So next up, speaking of decks that don't lose much of anything here, I bring you Temur Adventures. Now this should be a surprise to absolutely no one, because the adventure mechanic printed in Theros is the whole reason this deck even exists. So here's what it loses. Basically, it doesn't lose a damn thing. It loses its lands. And again, that's not to be underlooked now. Lands are important in Magic, so losing all these shock, these shock lands here is a big thing. However, Edgewall Innkeeper staying, Feawish is staying, Lucky Clover staying, Bonecrusher, Brazen Bar, Lovestruck Beast, Escape Blue Wilds, Beanstalk Giant, they're all staying. Now, it does lose some of its interesting sideboard cards, but when you only need one of all of these, it's so easy to replace those. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. This really just depends on what mana gets printed for as far as like the lands goes, but you still have your Ketria Triomes that'll be here, so you can make things happen. And a lot of times this deck doesn't need to specifically, like, it doesn't really get affected by the slow starts as much, because Lucky Clover, getting into double cast your spells, just buys you back so much time. Beanstalk Giant also lets you go search for those basics you need, so not as hurting for mana here as it could be. So Temur Adventures, this should be a surprise to absolutely no one. It gets 2 thumbs up as much as I hate it. So next up, we're going to talk about my Winota. This is some Mardu Winota. Now, there's obviously many different builds of Winota that you can build, but as a whole, Mardu seemed to be the most consistent one lately, so we'll take a look at that. Here's what the deck loses. So this is a kind of hard one to predict, but as a whole, I think it's in decent shape. So for this one, it loses Knight of the Ebon Legion. That's usually a 4-of for me to play. So losing that, just one of the best 1-drops you can be playing anyway. That's a big card to be leaving standard, and I It's like a love-hate relationship because there's times where I've absolutely hated that card because it's been so good against me, but it's also won me so many games that I'll miss it. Selfless Savior, very important in these Winota shells. It's here to stay. The Lesotop Reaver leaves, which for this shell in particular is a big deal. Lesotop Reaver, not a very exciting card whatsoever, but it's been a powerhouse in this shell, just being a 2-mana creature to generate 2 bodies that trigger Winota. Priest of Forgotten Gods. Now, I never personally played Priest in my build, so I don't think this really matters too much, but it is of note that it leaves 2, and we'll talk about that later because I'm happy about that. So, Raise the Alarm. Another card in Standard that isn't really a big Standard powerhouse, obviously, but for this deck in particular, it's been a really, really good one, so that losing this is actually a pretty huge deal. Getting to hold up this as blockers to kill something if you need, or just 2 more creatures to trigger Winota at instant speed. Really, really nice. Judith, one of the best triggers that you can hit off of Winota has been Judith. It's gone. No more Judith, so losing Judith, pretty big deal in these decks. Same with Tajik. Tajik was a pretty nice hit off of these. Now, this list only plays 1. Most of them played more than that, but Tajik gone. Another target for Winota. It's gone. Woe Strider. Woe Strider is here to stay from Theros, which is a big deal. Another creature that generates 2 bodies to trigger Winota. And this one is especially nice in these Mardu decks because it helps you find that Winota with the Scry abilities. So, Woe Strider staying, obviously really good for this deck. Winota obviously stays. Bazu Lieutenant here to stay. Venerated Loxodon leaves, which again for these decks is a really bad thing because this is a place where Venerated Loxodon did find a home and it made itself at home here. So kind of interesting looking at this one, but between the mana that it loses here, because you do want to play on curve with this one having your 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, so shock lands are very important. You know, you're losing the Loxodon, you're losing the Raise the Alarm, you're losing the Reaver, Judith. It's got a mixture of both enablers and payoffs for Winota that it loses, so I'm curious to see how this works overall. I think Winota is a strong enough card that if Zendikar Rising prints some answers and enablers for it, then maybe it can survive. But this one gets hit pretty hard, losing a lot of key cards for it, so I'll keep my eyes open for this one. But as a whole right now, not feeling too confident about this one staying. It needs a lot of help from this rotation in this set, so we'll see what it gives it. But as of now, thumbs down for Mardu Winota. So next up is Rakdos Sac / Jund Food. Now, obviously, these decks have gone through some changes with the banning of Cauldron Familiar, which, stay gone, Cauldron Familiar, stay gone. So we don't have the Witch's Oven, Cat Oven kind of thing going on here. However, these decks have adapted pretty well, and if you notice, they really don't lose a lot. Archfiend's Vessel, Claim the Firstborn, Serrated Scorpion, Village Rites, all here to stay. Now, they do lose Gutter Bones, which even though it's not a super exciting card, a 2-1-for-1 Savannah line kind of thing that can bring itself back is really nice for these kind of decks. Dreadhorde Butcher leaves, which is also pretty nice for them to lose because even though it wasn't played in the more traditional kind of sack decks with Cat Oven, Dreadhorde Butcher is still a really mean card for them. Be able to grow it, get aggressive, and then when you sack it, ping something as removal as well. Or that final points of damage they need to smash the face. So, pretty big loss there with Dreadhorde Butcher. Now, they do keep Fiend Artisan, they do keep Kroxa, they do keep Mire Triton, they do keep Call the Death Dweller, which are all key cards for them. Lurrus as a companion, still here to stay. And let's talk about the big one here, though, Priest of the Forgotten Gods. Priest is a card I am so ready to leave Standard. Never really been a big sack player myself, and it's lost me more games. Like that single card in Cat Oven, but more importantly, Priest of Forgotten Gods has just... It's caused me so much grief in this past since its existence in Standard, really. So, really happy to see that one go and for it to be taken out of the meta. But I think they actually can survive without it, which is the scary thing. Obviously, them losing it's a pretty big deal, but this isn't even taking into account that this deck can play the Woe Striders and whatnot as well. If you build it away where Lurrus isn't your companion. So, I don't know, man. Like we'll see what this deck does. Losing Priest of Forgotten Gods is a huge loss for it. But looking at it, there's so many good cards in this shell. They have things like Weaponizing the Monsters here they can have in there as well. So I'm gonna give this like a side thumb. Like I don't really know, but as a whole, again, they lose their biggest card. Not good, but they have so many other weapons here that still survive. I think they have a chance. As much as I hate to say it, let's go look at another deck. So next up, we're talking about some Izzet Prowess. I put this on here because it's actually started to become a force as of late. And it's a deck that I think actually survives pretty well post-rotation as well. When we look at the creatures on here, because the creatures are the biggest part of this deck, it loses Dreadhorde Arcanist, which is a pretty big loss for the deck because it rotating means you can't be flashing back these spells like you could before, getting those extra prowess triggers for your Sprite Dragon, for your Storming Entity. However, Dreadhorde Arcanist is a thing that, it still can be replaced But as a whole, you're still keeping your Sprite Dragons in this deck. You're still keeping your Bone Crusher Giants. Still keeping your Brazen Borrower, your Royal Scions, and your Storming Entities. So, like, as a whole, most of your threats in this deck still stay. As far as the 1-mana spells here, also most of them stay. And I think, like, losing some of these isn't a huge deal. Mainly because even the ones that lose here, like it's 1-mana cantrips, you find those all the time. These kind of things get reprinted all the time. So, pretty easy thumbs up for me here with Izzet Prowess. Obviously, a lot of this just depends on what the meta is. But as a whole, this deck doesn't really lose a lot. And the things that it does lose is something that I think that can be pretty easily replaced. So, Izzet Prowess, if you're looking for something for post-rotation, thumbs up from me. So this one we'll keep really brief because I think just looking at this from a glance, it's pretty obvious. This is what this deck loses. As you'll see, Temur Elementals, we knew thee well. You get to keep things like Euro, Terror of the Peaks, the Ultimatum. That's about it, though. Your Shocklands for the mana, gone. All your Elementals, gone. Terror of the Peaks can't do this on its own. So we'll keep this one short and sweet. I've had a lot of fun times with Temur Elementals myself, but it's also massacred me in some games as well. So no matter what the build of Elementals is, Elementals leave. So it doesn't matter. It's gone. Goodbye, Elementals. So 2 more decks to go. One of them being Simic Flash, a fan favorite / fan hated deck of the channel. I've really enjoyed my time playing Simic Flash when I have, but I can see why people hate it. In a weird spot here with this one, because while it does get to keep a lot of good cards like Brazen Borrower, Lofty Denial, Euro, that sort of thing, it loses Nightpack Ambusher, it loses Frilled Mystic, and it loses Brineborn Cutthroat, and Nissa, the ones that play Nissa. So you're talking about your top finishers, your top closers, and your top threats for Simic Flash all being gone. I think this may finally be the time where Dimir Flash has a little bit more say in the meta than Simic Flash does, because it gets to keep Slither Wisp and Cunning Nightbonder and that kind of thing. Whereas this one, its big threats and the reason you really want to play Simic are all leaving. Again, it can kind of depend on what cards get printed in Zendikar Rising, but when you're losing your cheap things like Brineborn Cutthroat that could grow and become a big threat was really good for this deck. And then obviously Frilled Mystic and Nightpack Ambushers was the reasons you play this deck, and they both leave. As much as it kind of pains my heart to say it, it's a thumbs down for Simic Flash. I don't think it exists. Words are hard. I don't think it exists past this meta once rotation hits. We'll have to see. Obviously new threats can be printed, but that's a lot of loss for this deck, and I just don't know if it can recover. One more deck to look at. I wonder what it could be. So last deck we'll look at here, Gruul Aggro, baby. Now, Gruul, again, can be built in a number of ways, but overall we have a lot of common themes here, and we'll take a look at, and this is, just bear with me because this is going to be kind of hard to get through for me. We lose Pelt Collector, we lose Domri's Ambush, we lose Zertot Goblin, we lose Gruul Spellbreaker, we lose Skargan Hellcat, we lose Shifting Ceratops to the sideboard, and we lose Domri. Stay strong, stay strong. Now, Gruul is resilient, and it can always rebuild with other good cards, but buy my mug. As a whole, I just don't know. Now, Gruul can always rebuild, like I said, though. We still get to keep Robber the Rich. We still get Bone Crusher Giants. We still keep Questing Beasts, which is one of the best cards, and we still get Embercleaves. The overall core of our deck still does get to stay here. We're just going to have to find some ways to build around it. Now, we still have our Fervent Champions. I'm sure we can find other 1-drops. This isn't taken into account. We still have the Stonecoil Serpents that we can put in here because I've never really been a huge fan of Pelt Collector anyways. I've been playing Annex in mine. Annex still stays. There is going to be a way to rebuild Gruul, so I don't care what the haters say. They can go F themselves. Gruul, 2 thumbs up! Gruul smash! I hope y'all enjoyed this look at the new look of New Standard, potentially. I can't wait to see what the spoilers for Zendikar Rising bring us, but overall, I think we're going to see some shifts in the meta, see what the new standard brings us. So, bask with me in the glory as we wait for this new standard. Goodbye, Nissa. Goodbye, Priest of Forgotten Gods. Goodbye, Hydroid Krasis. And goodbye to my viewers for now. Until next time, let's go.